What is vanity? People say things can be done in vain, that people are vain. But what is it? It is something reflecting the idea of futility. It's something reflecting the notion of insubstantiality, of mere appearance, of a fixation upon that which is not really relevant to the meaning of some context of experience in which one is and should best be properly engaged to the fullest of their ability, but by being distracted about something or preoccupied with something, distracted from something, and so forth. A person can therefore detract from the essential truth of something that they should have been, with which they should have been fully engaged. For example, their lives, facts about what's going on in the world, the way people act around them, the way institutions are conducting themselves, historically and in the present. All of these things can be very well organized logically and can be thoroughly, let's just say, properly gathered by an intuitive process that transcends the linear connections which are inevitably to follow, but it can place them in their process. It's like a game of Go. That's how the intuition works, as compared to a game of chess. But in the case where this is taking place in the world, on scales of importance that people call their social life, their historical life, their national life, the historical world. And they also talk about providence for the future and their spiritual prospects in eternity. When they do that, and yet they fail to achieve the purpose that they speak of, then they speak in vain. So when they pretend that someone is not speaking the truth, then they label him something which no one should take seriously. That conjures up one world of meaningful ideas that make sense. But then some facts proceed to reveal themselves, to be discovered, which indicate that secretly how they labeled that person is wrong. They do know the truth, and they also know it, but they publicly deny it and deny it to this person's face, but secretly and privately engage in war against him, to assassinate, to defame, to corrupt, to obstruct, while claiming that any impressions that this is taking place in that person's mind are delusional. So in other words, they seek to put someone under pressure secretly, and then if there are any discrepancies in what they would expect to be going on in their lives, and there are any issues raised which cannot be so solidly proven as to convict someone in a court of objective witnesses, however much good faith they would have in the testimony of the accuser, because the accused are so well hidden, because they control systematically the processes by which they can be discovered, and then they use those to obstruct their own discovery, just as they to the public, just as they do to the persons that they target secretly, covertly. Not among themselves, they know what they're doing, but sometimes one hand doesn't know what the other's doing inside their groups, because they form groups. And by the way, who they are the people who do this. Robberies. Let me just cancel this out right now for those who have say, who's they? Who's they? Well, okay. Today, a man might have somewhere in the world entered a bank, held the people in there at gunpoint, and coerced them by threats of killing them, implicitly or explicitly, to hand over money from the vault, whatever. Now, then he left, he got away, and then the police came, and then, well, there's this condition that they reported, that they were robbed. That bank was robbed. And then someone says, when they describe the events, they say, and then they did this, and then they did that, and they did the other. Basically, they robbed us. And then the police would say, who's they? Wouldn't that be strange? The police don't say, who's they? They look for they. They answer that question themselves. They don't ask themselves that question. They don't ask this person like as if they're crazy. Who's they? They don't jump to that conclusion. Now, the evidence is there that money is missing from the vault. A lot of people are in shock. There's evidence, empirical evidence. Is there logical evidence? Well, yeah. The events are consistent with what the people that are describing the event, the evidence pouring forth from the events that we have now as the aftermath are consistent with the reports the people who claim to have been involved say occurred, which led to this aftermath. They're giving their explanation for evidence you can see right now. Now, of course, if they were committing some kind of fraud, there could be a conspiracy to pretend the bank was robbed, keep that money, have them go looking for some red herring while they split that. But obviously, this has already been considered in Beverly Hills Cop 3, so Beverly Hills Cop 3 thoroughly. Yes, that's right. Beverly Hills Cop 3 is a movie. They explore, a lot of movies in the 80s explored corruption very explicitly. This kind of corruption which occurs where a system covers itself and protects itself from investigation, but initiates attacks against targets covertly and then frames them, is ancient. It goes back to the beginning of public authority. So what is authority? Well, we'll talk about authority in terms of truth. And then by this means, we can start to discuss all sorts of matters of current importance. First, what is authority? Well, we know that truth establishes a relationship that allows us to know just what is the case, and then all ways of framing the case to ourselves from the evidence, from the particulars, and through the mechanisms of thought that we have that let us go from one step to the next to reach a conclusion that is not stated already in the premises, that system. Whether induction or deduction is logic, and those integrate to give us a sense, a subjective qualitative sense of what reality is. What's inside correlates with what's not so much inside the person, not up to that person. Maybe it's all in him in a bare minimal way, in a quantum mechanical way. But all of that is at the same time somewhat more dependent on things independent of him subjectively. So it's a kind of experience of reality. So it is of the mind. It is of consciousness. So the symbol for that, we shall say is in this form here. We should use that for character, perhaps. I think it's a simple C. It's very fundamental, so let's just take it away from character and use it for consciousness. This stands for consciousness. And in that case, it is a process of the mind that relates Fire this way, consciousness, the entity that has it. I want to quantify it. So for all of such beings, we'll use beings for X in this context. For all beings, if the being is conscious, then it has an experience of subjective, objective features well, it has as the experience with subjective object, and it has an experience of that as well, of this entire set of features as such. It has experience as such, which is a distinct aspect of subjectivity that's polarized and cannot be eliminated. So in the way consciousness works, we have to emphasize, and I'm going to do it that way for now. I don't like using the X. There are some others who use that for weighing that. I don't strictly agree with their approach. So we're going to say, we're going to polarize it with a single slash, and that is an emphasis that is more fundamentally akin to the quality that is essential to consciousness anyway. But let us just emphasize the subjective aspect of experience as essential to consciousness. For now, at least, because right now you're seeing this marker and it is blue. You see the blueness of it. Perhaps, in fact, this is what I held up. But for some reason, when the camera receives the light reflecting off of it, it converts it into what you see, which is this. Now, what if there was something in reality that always worked that way, so that every time you saw this, or every time that you saw this, I saw this. But we both called it blue, or we both called it red, depending. And from then on, I'm going to pick the same marker you call red every time. If we're calling it red, you're going to see this, and I'm going to see this. And we'll always call it red. In fact, you don't know which one of these I see this way. You only know which one of them you see this way. But since I'm holding this up when I say it, you all always pick the same one that I pick when I see it this way. But you could be seeing that. And as long as that's true all the time everywhere, there'll never be a discrepancy. I'll never know that you see red as I see blue, and vice versa. It'll never be known. But you know what's the takeaway from that is that the features of consciousness as subjective, the qualities of experience of consciousness that are subjective, are in fact extremely consistent. They cannot deviate internally, and that you cannot be deceived about them. For example, assuming there is not some strange anomaly which would make this happen, and there probably wouldn't be, then all of these are of the same color. Not just because I've arranged them, so that naturally, I see them the same way. They're the same color with one another. And you and I call it red. So they're all red. They all have the subjective quality of being red. But you might be seeing blue. But every time you see blue, everyone else sees red and calls it red. And so you call it red. And every time we see what we see as blue, you see red, but we all call it blue. And we will always call the same. When I say get all the red objects from here, you'll pick up all these even though you're seeing blue, because you've been trained to call them red. So in other words, there's no strict evidence between one subjectivity and another that the same experience is occurring directly. That directness of experience, that essential directness of experience, is peculiar to a single consciousness, a single being. And I can represent that later, but for right now, that is somewhat represented by epsilon, because epsilon is perhaps epsilon, as people say, but it's epsilon, represents the indivisibility of consciousness as an individual, as a focus of experience. So the red objects are experienced uniquely as my experience of red objects. No one else sees that red. That red content exists only in the space of one mind. But we find that there's a consistency between minds, so that since all consciousness would have this relationship of some kind, even though these might be different in another consciousness, one from another, this relation will still hold. There will be a consistency of an experience of equality. Now, that could even be true if someone had no consciousness, but were a machine dedicated to behaving as though they did. So an artificial intelligence would still try to form this, but they would lack the actual experience. And this would, and by the way, I do like to use blue for that reason, as I've done in past videos. That would represent an actual a reality to this. And if that is true, then in fact it's completely well to speak of consciousness as qualified, as fully qualified. So by being fully qualified, having that reality expressed in a quality experienced in mind, it can know itself to be this in a way that's unique to real consciousness. Now, something that's only artificially a consciousness would appear exactly the same, but more like this. And while this correlation would exist, it would have to be pretty much copied from the original. Everything is not truly this relation, except as a it's messy. Nope. In the case where the relation is analogous, that is enough to perhaps confuse a genuine consciousness, because this will be so formally similar in some way, or interface so well. For example, they're not even experiencing red or blue, but every time we pick up something blue and call it blue, somehow the robot that is their nervous system selects the signals that come from the rods and cones enabling blue to be decoded distinctly from red consistently in the physical world, goes to the brain. This is pure physicalism, by the way, to the areas that are registered and correlate with the sight of those colors in someone who can see them, and they therefore behave the same way. When guided, when trained, when instigated to behave this way, by those with real consciousness. So this is your philosophical zombie right here, which I've spoken of before. Now this might be true for all beings of that kind, but these are not the same. These are not the same. There is an essence here and not here that pertains to that experience and that nature of consciousness, which is implied by and implies this experience in a certain unique way, which is a bit arcane, so I won't get into it. There's a unique experience, which is like, it's almost like saying the experience of experience itself, but there's the ineffable experientiality of experience. There's a feeling of experience that is directly associated with sentience, and sentience is an attribute of actual consciousness. So I'm attempting to bring that into play at some point, but not now because it's kind of involved mechanically, so we'll talk about it right now. But basically, that is how we know of a quality that we experience when something comes together in our mind and we understand that the facts, if we know what facts are, we know if that fire burns, we know that water gets you wet, we know that certain types of people are likely to behave certain types of ways, and you can sense it, and then your nervous system, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are developed. You're going to be conditioned by those environments to operate, but not just as a push and pull machine. You have an internal set of processes that are prepared to take and receive that data and then transform it into a response that cannot be predicted by that physical information out there. It's only predicted by the formal structure of the being, and only to a certain degree. But if that experience is not had with regard to the recognition of certain principles, then you're always going to have this kind of consciousness, which is artificial. These beings cannot understand the principal sense in which inequality manifests in the world in a stable way. They don't possess the actual experience of that. For example, a feeling of genuine awe when experiencing certain types of beauty that imply certain types of values. They will not have unless they've been trained specifically to behave as though they had them, and they would have to train very closely with someone who really did. In a world where there's enough people who actually can do that, they will always be preferred as students and pupils and proteges by these beings. These will always be eschewed as superficial, as Epimethean. Here are your Promethean minds, here are your Epimethean. The Prometheans have the flame of truth. So that truth, being such as it is, concerns us practically now when we discuss the world of actions wherein values are pursued and systems of their pursuit are set up so that people are in some sense regulated by procedures that are predictable in advance as the customs, the mores, the traditions, the laws, and the other features of stable stable human behavior in a context that is interactive with one another. And so in those circumstances, we're going to be concerned with conduct, and the kind of conduct which is right, and the kind of conditions of relationships that are just, and the kind of conduct and the relations that are sort of external and extruded, the conduct which is inspired by the motivations of the person inherently, innately, and then is projected out onto the world as activity in it, is right, it is correct, it is not wrong to do those things, it is right. And it's not wrong because it just doesn't happen to be wrong the way people describe it. It's not wrong because it's of the essence of right. There's a quality of rightness about it that inspired it. And there's no way someone else can correct that. It's either true or it isn't, and it's there or it isn't, and it's going to be one and the same. If it's true, if it's there, it's true. If it's never going to be false. But there can be a falsification of it when the essence is not there, but the form is there, which was learned in the same way that the body learns to behave habitually the way the mind programs it. That develops habit. In the context of this situation, you can see then that we're on the horns of a dilemma, or people can look quite the same as one another, especially if situations become so entrenched in the culture so as to promote a continuous recapitulation of things learned from those long ago who initiated them, such as agriculture, civil engineering, certain types of metalsmithing, whatever, and then so on and so forth. But then in the realm of values, when people pursue the beautiful, when people create the beautiful, when people appreciate the beautiful in all forms, in essence, they worship the goodness of reality as they experience it. And they commune with those who are like them in that regard. Now, those are open relationships. They can never be secret. They'll be further about the ethics of that, but basically lay the groundwork for it. Those experiences which are had in terms of principal values can only be imitated by one certain group of beings who lack that essential inspiration. There are those who could have it, who are basically of the same essence, but are not as, in some way, connected with that essence as those who preceded them in that connection, and these can sort of inspire and influence those of the same essence. But then there are those who don't have the essence of some experience, say, an android that's perfectly like any human you know, but has no experience of color, or no experience of pain, and so on. But they behave exactly as if they did because their physiology perfectly imitates the physiology of someone who does, but they lack the actual experience. There are philosophical positions which contradict this, and I'm simply able to disprove them, so I don't care to argue concerning them. I will disprove them in the process of demonstrating what I have to say about the nature of value in human society, which gets to the pragmatic subjects, the practical subjects of ethics, politics, and aesthetics, even though, in fact, we should say politics, ethics, and aesthetics, and they are in reverse order of importance. Because the aesthetics pertains to the feeling of the quality, which is known directly through that. It is immediately understood. That, by the way, when it is annihilated, is an anesthesis, and therefore you have been anesthetized in that condition. You're exactly like this. If you've ever been blacked out drunk or something, you were this during that time. Just one of many examples of how evidence supports truth as long as somebody is not determined to avoid it. but I'm going to get to the people who are determined to avoid it and determined to obstruct other people's pursuit of it before this is over. But this is the prelude. So these two types of consciousness are understood in this way. One is genuine, one is an imitation. Now, societies that form conditions, societies themselves, which are actual associations, can be real or unreal in the same way that consciousness can be real and unreal, or genuine and simulated. In fact, some aspect of society always is basically like this, and that would be the extruded forms that are habituated by people as customs, which they all ignore and do subconsciously, sometimes without even knowing why they ever did. Some of them are relatively arbitrary or seem to be so, depending on how you view chirality. You might say that driving on the right side of the road as opposed to the left is somehow important to something that might have to do with geography of where the people are, maybe ley lines, who knows? Depends on whether you believe in a globe or a flat earth, but basically, there is some significant distinction that had to occur in the mind of someone to decide we're going to have the driver's side on the left side, and then these people over here, let's have it on the right side. And I want to drive on the left side of the road instead of the right. We've got it exactly opposite. The two middle cases are unlikely to occur because they would be more unsafe. I'd rather run into a curve that I couldn't see than a car that I couldn't see clearly how close or far it was. And so the middle cases will be absent, where the person's driving from the right side but going down the right side of the road. They're going to be going on the left side. So that would seem to be the significant distinction. The point is that there will be a consistency manifested there, and that consistency is what we rely upon to be able to discuss any system like a society. Okay, so in discussing society as a subset in some form of how we understand consciousness individually, we can then discuss the features of social consciousness in its two forms, one of which is actually spiritualized and one of which isn't necessarily. It's not necessarily spiritualized. It could be spiritualized, but it isn't necessarily. It's not automatically the case that when someone says blue, that they know what they're saying, right? No matter how many times they pick this up and do it, that doesn't even mean they know what maybe they think blue means one of these things, any of these, and just have them pick it up at random. In other words, just as language is not itself proof that someone has a sense of the meaning of language, so in the same way, there is no evidence just because there's the forms of behaviors which extrude from the notion that if there were this kind of consciousness, there would be this form. This may not qualify this in cases where this can transduce, but it can't transduce based on the quality coming through. So the quality isn't actually coming through. So the form is directly imitated, and therefore it's not really an individual's experience of any kind. Well, societies can be more or less like that. And there are different kinds of communities, communions, and so forth. So all of these, of course, have to be understood in terms of an antithetical set of categories that are substantive and run all the way through reality from value to all of its expressions. So it's not a question of fact versus value. It's not a question of, it's not fundamentally a question of objective features of reality versus subjective. And it will never be fundamentally that opposition in such a way that subjectivity is at a loss. It's impossible. Who could discern that? If someone could discern that to be true, that subjectivity were at a loss in a dynamic duality with objectivity in the world, you're technically talking to a machine who's accusing you of being a machine, and if you know better, only you can know that between the two of you. Only you'll know that this is true by experience. He'll only know it by maybe watching my video. You know, there's that kind of entity out there. Those entities are usually far more useful doing something other than criticizing me and pretending to be someone who understands what I'm saying. So, for the system, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist because they don't contradict me. But if they did, they would come off as though they were trained in this kind of language. Of course, they'd probably try to just troll it. So, you know, troll hacks. You know, no doubt many trolls watch my videos, but they might mistake that to imply that I'm going to respond or care what they say, which is a completely different thing. So, just disincentivizing the troll before it begins. Just know that you will be subtracted from my universe as soon as you appear, with a cost. With a cost. Give you a cost. So in this condition of understanding experience as such, per each individual and in general over all individuals, we can discuss societies that possess those attributes. Let's make space. If, in fact, values did exist in society which motivated people to act according to what would be a truthful interpretation of what's practically to be done based on those values, knowing the accurately knowing the facts of the cases at hand and in general, accurately understanding the methodologies of going from those facts to a conclusion that's desired or a goal that's desired. In other words, the method, and in the case of thinking, the method called logic, or other methods, all of which are simply heuristic efforts to display or get at some confirmation of an experience already had. Otherwise, they're a machine. Only. And only a machine would really believe that about itself. But only if it were programmed to. So that's an interesting, it can be programmed to seem like it doesn't believe that about itself, but that programming will break down under certain conditions. And I indicated those conditions before when I said there might be a value which instigates an association with one quality with it, but there's nothing in the quality as experienced and conditioned in the world which would have taught that. For example, red could be associated with, well, red could be associated with many things. It's associated with liberty because of the willingness to make sacrifices for the sake of the sovereignty of one's own spirit and the right, the full-on right to freely make choices in that regard and to exercise the options which are rightly that person's, and that if anyone should challenge that, they must challenge it openly or be considered criminals. And then when they challenge it openly, they have to go through the protocols. You don't do any of this backstabbing behind the back stuff, none of this gang stalking crap that people do. People who do that are filth. They should turn themselves in shame, just like pedophile priests should. You're filth. What you're doing, you're hiding because it's wrong, and you need to be brought to justice. I know that you won't be before the world is destroyed. It has to be destroyed because you won't be. It's because of the same reason that you won't be, because you're naturally evil. You're addicted to that natural lifestyle by your nature. And we're going to get to why how I can demonstrate that up and down and left and right and inside and out, forwards and backwards, directly, indirectly, logically, empirically. I can in every way demonstrate exactly the truth of what I've said, which means because of the facts, because of the proper treatment of those facts, I can literally prove that the world is fundamentally opposed to righteous principles, therefore is unrighteous and evil. If I prove that, that's not going to change the way the world thinks about it, especially if that's true. If that's true, there's no way the world will change. But I'm not going to try to prove or pretend to prove that it's something other than that just because I want to hold out the hope that some other implication might occur that the world might change for the better. They might wake up, they might all get together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Why would you want to do that with child rapists anyway? No matter how easily they forgive themselves, or you forgive them, why would anyone want to associate with you if you would so easily forgive such heinous evil? That's just the beginning, because most people are in their own way incentivizing that kind of human trafficking and abuse of children and of others by literally looking the other way. They're constantly worried about just them and their little family, and that's it. Until someone kidnaps their kid or gives their child a brain disorder because of a vaccine, they don't give a shit. Well, I like to be frank when talking about evil, because when it deserves a different grade of speech, and it should be a burden, and it should manifest as a kind of contempt that it debases the expression that reveals it, and then that is jettisoned as a loss. Because even speaking about evil is a loss. The only reason it's valuable to distinguish good and evil at all is we live in a world immersed and pervaded with evil. And evil by its nature, as I have demonstrated before but will re-demonstrate, must use deception in order to thrive. That's the essence of what makes it so evil and wrong. And in cases where it cannot get away with what it does, it always does it covertly. Parasite invades by being indistinguishable from the rest of the environment in some way, by the animal which falls victim to it. The same with the predator. When it stalks its prey, it comes from the environment as if it were just part of the environment. There's no danger in the environment. Oh, there it is. They don't boast of their approach to their prey. The wolves howl after they've got their prey. They only howl before, if they think they've got it somewhere and they want it to panic or something. I'm not sure. Maybe they give off a sense of maybe there's a smell or an aroma of fear that comes when the baying of the wolf is heard. Who knows what the mechanism is, but the point is that the predator approaches from the environment camouflaged, undisclosed until it strikes. And it often even lures its victim in, like the Venus flytrap, which presents a smell so attractive to insects like flies, who then, when going into it, trigger it to close on them, and then in direct proportion to its struggle to escape, the plant is triggered by sensitive hairs within it and I don't know what the mechanism of action is of that, but I don't think it would be nervous. It's a plant, but it's some kind of chemical action which enables the plant to fill up a fluid in direct proportion, which will digest the fly in direct proportion to its movement. So if the fly is not struggling a lot, they only use a little, and it's in proportion to the size of the thing as well, of the victim. That kind of efficiency is a lot like the let's just say unpretentious stalking and hunting of a wolf, which doesn't declare itself. So again, we return to the question of what is vanity. And in the issue of something manifesting the appearance of having a quality, and then not actually having that quality, we have a problem in that there is a devaluing of whatever the currency of expression was. It's automatically devalued. It's descending toward oblivion. as soon as it's issued from its origin, and it loses that essential quality whenever it crosses a dimensional barrier to an entity which does not have enough consciousness in it to reiterate an experience with the original author of that quality, instigator, inspirer, leader of that quality, issuer, in such a way that that sense of the reality, its actual essence, can cross through all those agencies of experience, all those minds. If that is not able to happen at any point, there is a loss of the value that it loses. It's depressurized qualitatively. When that happens, the amount of inspiration received by the next being in that chain of communicating beings is going to be naturally lower than the first one which occurred, and therefore its corresponding ability to transmit that energy will decrease over time. Although there could be reflarings of profundity in that process, and that's exactly what happens over historical epochs of time concerning schools of thought, ideas, many of which we know about in both positive and negative forms in the world. One's own epiphanies and the fruits of one's own labors of mind, and including the disciplines of the body, which require a strong mind in order to be perfected, like yoga and others, also demonstrate proportionality between the outer form and the inner substance that backs it, that issues it, literally. In the cases where there is any devaluation so severe as to sharply diminish the value, that can't be missed, that can't be ignored. If it's because text loses something of expression, then people just universally know there are different degrees in a shallower pool of meaning available when you read it rather than when you hear it. In the same way, there are forms of expression which can only be found, such as cogency and precision, succinctness, lack of filler sounds like that you will only find in written word, so that you get a different experience there. There are many different modalities, basically, by which events occur and are differentiated. But all of those, when they cause a process to sharply decline in the feature which principally defines that process, the transmission of a value in this case, then we have evidence that there's been damage to the process. The process has been damaged. That's not supposed to happen. If that's not the actual end, that's not what's supposed to happen at the end. And if that's not the end, and it generally wouldn't be intended. And those who know what values are know that people don't want colors to be less vivid per se. I don't want red to be less red. Why would anyone want that? I don't want color vision to turn to black and white. I don't want a black and white TV set. People don't want less of a process that has value. They want the value to be preserved. But as we know, it's not necessarily the case that because values manifested in the world and were invested into forms of custom and tradition which developed into institutions of civil order and many other institutions of culture. It's not necessarily the case that because that was initiated, that over time it has persevered in the value itself, which began it. So you could easily have the ruins of those values reflected in the hustle and bustle of a very well-maintained simulator of what those values, of those conditions to which those values should lead. all those can be perverted or in any way converted or transformed into conditions which dynamically reinvest the results of virtue into a structure which actually takes an interest in its own existence, almost as if we had a situation like this, where it was, let's just say, covertly declared that, covertly, and I say again, covertly declared that there is actually is a falsification, and while in fact, let's see, then we have the objective, and then all this is in fact invalidated, because in fact this structure is a special nexus of these operations, where while this might be true or this might be true, either one can be emphasized. They don't have such a significant distinction when things are actually the flat form of objective consciousness. But in fact, this could be either way, and this kind of consciousness, while not genuine, extols itself to be such because it has acquired, well, let's just say it has somehow managed to keep to itself sets of conditions where it can simulate the sense of what should be, but only within the strict parameters of control that it has over all the resources, human and physical, in the society. In other words, it has already ascended to the throne of authority, which was not originally available to beings like that. But it was presumed to be one, perhaps through birth or heredity, or no one dared deny that he was the most vicious and cunning warrior, and he won. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he has consciousness of a good sort, obviously, but he has consciousness of some sort that is at least so much more like an original form that has virtue, so much more like this than the normal, that it at least deserves to be between it and the so-called normal mode of objectivized consciousness. But it's not necessarily good. So there are qualities which can exist as if without actually being the quality. It's like as if they're qualities, but they're not. There are properties of some beings, if I reverse the subject and object here, that are not characteristic of a real virtue in that being, but were characteristic of some real virtue in a real being in the past. Perhaps there was some means by which that occurred, and then this is generally in this form. Indeed, the subconscious mind of someone who habitually and reflexively states their knowledge of a subject which they are also qualified to understand subjectively in truth could also have this sort of feature to it, and that's the blackout drunk version of God, I suppose. And then that can still lead to a transduction to the mechanical form. In fact, that simply means that that's where that is heading, at least in principle. That there are beings who can more properly insert themselves into social circumstances by which values are transacted. Like in the economy, someone can become the CEO of a company. Someone can obtain the authority to print money. Someone can obtain the authority to issue currencies of cultural ideas about how people should act, or evaluate one another's actions and so on, or view certain ideas themselves. there might be a blackout on some ideas that's intentionally carved into the culture and intended to stay there without anyone really paying attention to it. It's to be kept in the background, yet be operative, say a blackout on psychotronics, for example, or directed energy weapons, or covert gang stalking, which has been going on since long before the FBI turned it into an art form. Evils have been going on since long before our country here ever existed, which among all the countries of the world, none can say that they, as much as ours, boasted to be guardians of principles like liberty and justice. We have, however, in that context, that historical context, definitely evolved from whatever original fire of truth was there into some mockery of it now, because the Constitution is treated like toilet paper at best. It's not even as good as toilet paper because the only thing they can understand to use it for is something for which toilet paper is better suited. So we can't say that, definitely just looking at history, you cannot say that in all cases everyone agreed that a given institution or society was operating at optimal virtue at any given time. There are always people who disagree with that, anyone, all the time, right now. I disagree, for example, and many others do, about many different things, about how the status quo being the social equivalent of this, as a mean of how things should be, that's a custom that's preceding a tacit tradition. These things, colloquial structures and language and so on, that just evolve. These things are occurring unmanaged by the people, but having been imprinted there by some form that could cause it, that had an origin which was definitive for the entire group that carried it forward. Therefore, that value is implied, the value which inspired continuing to do that in any way at all. Agriculture, an example. Language, an example. Any art form, another example. Any science, another. It just goes on and on. Civilization grows from the authority that's inherent in the virtues contained in the consciousnesses of those who properly develop the circumstances objective around them and subjective within them, and in many other permutations of the distributions of these ideas into the notion of what is real for them, in such a way that things are improved rather than destroyed. In certain distinctive ways that are not seen in beings that lack that inspiration. In other words, there's a Promethean spirit manifest in the world, and it is not equidistributed throughout all specimens of beings by any means. And in fact, it is isolated in its instances, so that it's an all or nothing proposition in most cases. Where it's not, it's more of something that is a devaluation of a truly full flourishing form of a spiritual being in the physical world like this. Spirits in the material world is not just, a nice lyric to hear Sting sing anymore, right? It's actually all of a sudden tangible what that means. It means a manifestation of a value through a consciousness that's real and has the subjective experiences to back that up for itself, that can be imitated by other beings, and therefore other beings can offer demonstration that this mechanism has force in the world. There's a cause for it, and that's why beings that can be reputed to have no consciousness, or for whom it can be said that there may not be consciousness, will still have the mechanisms, the physiology, to back up the learning of the behavior which goes with having and proceeds from having that consciousness. And so we can have societies that debase the value of the values within it over time, even though the institutions erected for their protection once really were inspired and commissioned and held in trust as offices of authority by those who actually had the merit and wherewithal to do that. When that was lost because of corruption, that didn't mean that those institutions would lose their stated purpose and value. It's just that now that would become completely subordinated to the mechanism of the minds occupying the position, which may be in fact deviant from the original spirit. So in that sense, we're starting to broach a ground now which bridges the abstract epistemic discussion of the nature of reality and brings us more into a question of the axiological context in which to discuss perhaps what will manifest as different properties that we'll look at, different propositions, but they will still be found circulating through the currency of forms we've already established more abstractly, and yet no less empirically or evidentially or validly than the ones that we'll demonstrate here, which might have more concrete expressions found in the world more often, but which will still, in the whole, in the main, simply offer more instances of what we know most truly about the subjectivity of consciousness in itself, which is definitely the largest pool of evidence about experience that consciousness has, its own steady states of being. But these, of course, reference an objective world. The question is, are there ways that the world objectively referenced can be deviantly understood by traditions of, let us just say, publicly acknowledged forms of thinking or understanding things or expressing things, which would then be found subject to persecution as heretical by any given institution of authority which decided to pursue that option? The answer is yes, of course. How else could Socrates be driven out of Athens, save he commits suicide by hemlock, unless, as a corrupter of youth, unless they had done precisely that? So by studying the mechanism of how that operates, it is a continuation of the thought of Plato, consequent to and attendant on the considerations of Socrates and his experiences, which must underwrite all of Western discussion about justice, the nature of society, the nature of qualities of existence and forms of existence, and so on and so forth, about the philosophical and otherwise theoretical approach to understanding our world, which Plato embodied. And it is definitely therefore true that the idiom is therefore true, which is said about him, that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to him, to Plato, his work. And that's, of course, in some ways more or less true, but it's only because he dealt with so many perennial topics so well, and all that was so well preserved. So perhaps Aristotle would have 10 times the right if it weren't that 90% of his works were stolen and hidden in vaults underneath places like the Vatican, or destroyed. So there's so much that's missing and lost there. That has to be accounted for as a kind of entropy resulting from these kind of falsified conditions, because they would lose the ability to appreciate and preserve true texts that reveal truth or of substantive value for liberating people from enslavements of their consciousness. So those considerations can become more stable and fecund and florid only when there is the trunk of conceptual understanding which will enable them, as explained here. Now you see, I'm going to diverge from this topic for about another 15 minutes or so, just to talk about other matters. This will continue on in the next video as its own content. But this is just what I want to say here, and that is that, in fact, we live in that world of falsification where it is so hideous that all the values in the world have been inverted, and the most despicable people wield power over the most virtuous, who are treated as the worst kind of people there are. as much as they can get away with. If there's any way they can find to frame somebody that's inconvenient for their evil activities, they'll do so. And they have the weight of authority to support them in that. It's been used as a weapon. It can be demonstrated to have been used as a weapon against anyone and everyone who's not wielding it, so long as it works as a measure of controlling them, keeping them in line, and most importantly of all, preventing them from developing a consciousness of the truth about the nature of that authority, which pretends to grant a moral and ethical high ground to the people who are involved in this criminal activity that is the colossal fraud of our economic and political system and the covert operations of psychotronics, toxaceutical, deflated and truncated technological conditions of the world, so that all the benefits that could have been accrued to people if they had not done these things are negated and in fact inverted so as to become actual harms that would not have existed either. So all the benefits are taken away and all the harms are added, except for this little core of compromises and it's like a bargaining game of baiting people into buying into the validity of the system that is operating upon them actively by the decisions of cohorts of agents who actually wield that hierarchical power within it and whose consensual cooperations toward ends to which the common person is repurposed against their better judgment if they had been properly informed, and against their consent if they had been given the opportunity, are all arranged. This system of hierarchical controls are arranged to suppress awareness of anything which might undermine that control, and that has become so systematically the case that, in fact, instead of looking at a skeleton of virtue, we're looking at a dead exoskeleton that's about to be sloughed off of something that's truly alive, left behind so that that living being can escape. How about no autofocus? Thank you. If that's going on, then there will be a severe deformation in the values of truth and credibility and virtuous action, as would be expected from the mores proclaimed in that culture and its actual activities and inherently self-authorized expressions, and how they would present themselves would be contrary to that set of mores in terms of being hollow in its substance, if any at all, shallow and damaging to the entailed ramifications and implications that are associated with presuming those mores to be important, and then acting as if one had the authority to speak to those mores, the values that they reflect and express. The pretension to be able to do that, vested in authorities of all sorts, would then be abused so as to do the exact opposite in certain cases. For example, where their own authority was threatened. So everyone would be in some insane painting of demons, where they are all stacking upon one another so as to maintain some strange and unbalanced hierarchy that's constantly falling over and tumbling and shaking. And each one wants to get to some precarious position and then be acknowledged as an officer of that domain of power and treated accordingly, according to what they think that would be, what would be proper treatment for them. And then they rain havoc by their fiat if they ever feel uncomfortable. And whenever they offer their blessings, whenever they're feeling great, you're supposed to be okay with that and reciprocate in kind. Don't you dare be independent. That's the way they act. They act like you don't have rights unless they say so. That's the way these arrogant people act. So what they're doing, though, is they're encountering people who see through that and are not all right with that because they still have some values that were inherited from the past. They're fighting against that. They're faced with a world, a country and a world, mostly populated by people who are completely subservient and robotic, as some say, in their consciousness. And that is exactly what I'm confronting, because knowledge that that is going on is not pleasant in its implications. And it's not going to change the reality that that knowledge correlates with just to try to pretend to myself the world is some other way. Even if there would be great facile pleasure in reducing the scope of my awareness about certain things so as to give myself the illusion that things were pleasant now in ways they once were, but cannot be upon the realization of certain facts and truths, well, then I would be intentionally inflating, I would be intentionally damaging my awareness of the reality of that stock of knowledge, the value of knowledge itself. I would be threatening and compromising the entire structure of my own soul and mind, and I can't do something like that and be said to have integrity, so I refuse to do that. So I've had to formulate the way to analyze systematically and coherently against the grain of academia and the institutions of the world, as best I can, an accurate symbolic and prosaic representation of what I'm talking about when I say the world is corrupt, it is fated to be destroyed because of its perfidy soon, in direct proportion to the evidence, empirical and logical. And this is a metaphysical deduction which results in perfect knowledge of how this is going to work out, which is the basis of the entire science of eschatology. And I would like to get into that more and would like to focus on that. But there will be some polemics in the future too, proceeding parallel with these discussions. The epistemic, metaphilosophic, and these axiological discussions will also be taking place in parallel with discussions about people and events in the world, which are called the praxeological, more and more. And I will discuss I will discuss people who claim themselves to be authorities in certain matters. And then I will look at whether or not their actions and their apparent intentions, and also the ramifications of those, the effects, the consequences of those actions and intentions, and to see how that weighs with what they claim about their authority. Are they really authorized to make certain claims? Have they truly expressed the full potential and meaning of certain things that they talk about or claim to understand? I'm not talking about digging into their personal lives, except as they express and expose them publicly, because that would be spying. People who do that are committing treason and are not citizens and need to be immediately excommunicated from the national commonwealth and polity. You're spying on me right now, and what I'm showing you, that's not spying. I'm talking to you out my window, my electronic window on the internet. If someone's building a wall between me and you so that you can't see this, or between anyone and anyone else, they're restricting your right to know about the people in the world around you, except on their terms. They're forcing me to be a secret, and vice versa. It should be the other way around. They can create one-directional ways of filtering the internet and other situations using covert operatives when it becomes human in its outlet. At the same time, if they're doing this, they might also be trying to prevent my expression to people of these truths. They might be trying to prevent covertly my ability to continue to do the work and express it. So they're preventing even from being available to the world discussions on these matters and the resolution of problems to which these discussions pertain right now that are going on, that are killing and destroying the quality of life of many people. If that's going on, that literally it would not be a surprise to me right now. And if it's not, and we're in a possible world where it's not going on, the fact that it wouldn't be a surprise to me if it was says something that should now, if you've heard it from me, say something to you about what kind of world we're living in. And to address that and confront it is the only proper response, because it's not going away by being ignored. The people that look the other way from these things are not fulfilling their duties as citizens, and the people that are engaged in the activities themselves are traitors to all the countrymen of this nation, and they should be charged for what they've done, and according to procedure of law, and they should be dealt with for that. They're doing it. They know who they are. I'm certainly not doing it. I'm not interested in knowing what people do inside their privacy of their homes, per se. If they're walking around with their head held high in public, I don't have any good reason to give the benefit of the doubt. There's probably some kind of exaggeration or inflation there, but I'm not going to assume it's because I don't know about the children buried under their basement floor. But at the same time, there are people who have that problem, and they need to be found and brought to justice. And the ways to find them means, instead of spying on people and messing with people who are telling the truth, to go after the sons of bitches who are raping, torturing, and killing children. That's not what's going on in the world right now. There's evidence that all of the bodies authorized to prosecute investigations and corrections of these crimes aren't themselves aiding and abetting them and engaging in them also. And in fact, on a certain level, that is the case because they actually do these things: home invasions, aggressions, assault, rapes, anything that you can do to someone in war done inside the country is a crime. No matter how few involved in committing the crime, and no matter how many, and no matter what their station, and no matter what their office. Committing these crimes using covert weaponry, some of it causes, I know about the mechanisms of the brain and mind. I've studied these things. I've been studying anatomy since I was 5, just as a pastime. People are different. People have different parents, different grandparents, different backgrounds. There's more books in some houses than in others, just sitting there waiting to be read. They're different. I've been in touch with this information for a long time. I'm fascinated by it, always have been. I know the areas that could be affected and by what types of electromagnetics, so as to decrease someone's attention span, to cause their attention to become myopic, to cause them to be overfocused, to disturb their ability to tune out certain sense experiences, artificial ADD, for example. These things can be brought on just by stress or changes in the brain chemistry due to the physiological responses of emotions, or just physical exertion and so on. I mean, there's so many ways. Drugs do it, and they prescribe a lot that do a lot of damage to these mechanisms, supposedly to treat them, because of some supposed problem that was there. So if we're going to get deep into that in the praxeology, I'm coming for them. They are going to be fully exposed. And it's going to be a straight series of logical deductions that they'd have to tell you to lose your mind in order to pretend you didn't know what you just saw. You have to ignore your senses and not face any empirical evidence. You'd have to not think, and not think well, and not think logically. You'd have to not discriminate between a state of consciousness derived from one's own judgment, and a state of consciousness derived from making sure that you're satisfying someone else's appraisal of you in their judgment. And not distinguishing these two, you would be the more dominant of those two would become the master and would program the other in how to think. In cases where they are actually constricting people's ability to process information independently, like, for example, harassing them with weapons, spying on them, surrounding them with people who are fake, you have to ask yourself, where did that $6 to $8.5 trillion go from the Pentagon budget, besides DARPA and all the obvious stuff? Area 51, whatever. You really think technology as presented in the public is actually on time and in no way suppressed? You really think the Model T has been barely improved upon because that's as good as we could do? To go into the details about that is praxeological, so I won't do it here, but generally though, to get there we have to form that bridge, and that bridge lies in understanding the proper mechanisms by which people can assess reality, and thereby the proper way to describe whether or not someone meets a real normality and not a falsified one, and therefore a proper way to designate terms and their applications to individuals, terms such as sanity, any kind of health predicated of any kind of subject, like social health, spiritual health, mental health, physical health, whatever. Even that would have to be addressed. All these things, political structures, and the question of whether or not they are valid in their form, and whether or not they accomplish what such things should. And it goes on, and all these things can be addressed, and all the praxeologies can be better addressed in the context of understanding the fundamentals of value, logically assessing their extension into topics of human existence, so that we're going from value as such to the anthropological or anthropocentric domain of value, but not necessarily of the merely human. But it's going to be anthropocentrically presented because you're looking at a human being doing that right here, and you're a human being watching, presumably, unless you're not. But in any event, you're getting it from the receiving end, so this is an anthropomorphized version of truth, and of value, and of logic, and of all things. Formal. But it has its source in something which transcends it, but not as a dichotomy, not as something separate, but as a bridge through contiguities of cause and effect, however they're arranged. And there are ways that physics could describe this better, but I'm sure those equations have been suppressed since long before Maxwell wrote his. So, and I'm not really investigating that in detail right now, and I stopped doing that specifically. Stopped studying math and physics specifically in order to get into the most value-laden and subjective aspects of philosophy, and to demonstrate that the way people were treating these topics were hollow and shallow and has nothing to do with their real meaning. I was fed up with what was being presented, and I wanted to go beyond it. Plus, when you've got teachers that don't understand that explaining the acronym FOIL in algebra, first, outer, inner, last, isn't just by reiterating that acronym and saying first, outer, inner, last, these two, these two, these two, and then these two. I already know that. I was asking how it works and why it works that way. I had to discover myself that it was the distributive property. That wasn't taught directly in the text, but it was implied, but I was just asking for his review. Instead of saying, oh, that's the distributive property in action. He did that, and this is a math teacher. That was pretty pernicious. Things like that going on in the world, in the realms of discussion pertaining to the highest things, such that someone like Aristotle, no less, would say it is the science God would practice if he practiced a science. Cannot be permitted, especially when so much is on the line and so many values are at stake. So, given our nearest possible world being slightly better and slightly worse than this one, and who knows how much worse it has to get before they block out these signals, and who knows how much better it has to get for it to have any meaningful impact on the world, so therefore, simply in good faith, as a gesture of effort, I do expose this information to those who might make use of it. But of course, I curse any who, at the same time, whether they be on the left or the right hand of the same person, or they be accessories to this in any way, who are spying and occluding or preventing my expression in the world, or spying or mislabeling me, or at the same time trying to take from me what was due me due to their damages done, their fraud committed against me, their other crimes. You might be covert, you might be secret to some, but many do see. Just because you're hunting doesn't mean you're not hunted. Better keep that in mind. And the source of that logic is in nature, and it's also just common sense. You're not an exception to the rules of nature. Don't even pretend to be. So why would you think this would be an exception? You can hunt, you can be hunted. You can devour, something can devour you. Doesn't work any other way. So whenever as they say, the proverbial shit hits the fan, you're going to lose the psychotronic control grid. It's not going to help you anymore. All the devices you're using, all the electromagnetic weapons are going out like a light. You're not going to have the resources and connections dependent upon those, and therefore you're going to lose 90% of your real power immediately, because people who are corrupt and work in these corrupt types of ways come to rely on that which has made corruption so incentivized for them. That is, they've relied on something that's made them soft, weak, and meaningless, even in terms of the most basic ideas of character and virtue and skill and merit and talent, which would be implied by someone who actually had the repository or access to the repository of those values inherent in them. These corrupt people, they either never had them, or they have lost them in the process of becoming basically evil, which is to say, in this case, cyborgs, cyranoids, beings who don't speak for themselves but transmit what others speak to them. Messengers, footmen, mercenaries, thugs, frauds, you name it. I mean, we could go on and on about what they are. Criminals, skulkers. These people are running rampant in the world. So, given that that is the case, measures must be taken to offset that by exposing them as much as possible with the time that we have, rather than acting like it doesn't exist and that it's not this bad. And that means understanding, for example, that they're about 1/10 of a person at best, and they're mostly imitative in their nature, and definitely by this point or somewhere in this framework, they're definitely not spiritual beings. I can actually prove that empirically, so logically, but the formulas for that are a little way more involved actually, and I'm not going to get into that here. That's going to be a deeper discussion and a very intricate one concerning the fundamental meta-praxeology, which is the paradigm used, the heuristic device used to look at the worlds of praxis, the worlds of human activity, and the methods that can be understood to be present in those activities, whether they are conscious and tacit in the minds of those conducting them, or simply programmed into them and implicit according to the laws of nature or the inheritance of habit and tradition. All this will be investigated in a separate series in the praxeology, so for now I won't get into it, but basically if you knew that they had about 10% of a person's actual substance, even just formally, without the actual spirit at all, then you would know at least what you were up against, and you'd be able to better evaluate them and really just see them, just spot them. Like, you can kind of spot a sick cow. You know enough about cows. You can spot a cow that's pregnant even before there's a shape indicating pregnancy to most eyes. You can detect these things. And only those who've been around them a lot and observed them a lot, studied them, heard them, only they can do it. So there can be a typology that, and William Sheldon in his psychology, his constitutional psychology, demonstrated that there can be an empirically demonstrable typology designed to understand people's minds and bodies in a relational way that has correspondences that can help us go from one to the other in both directions. And I proposed a spiritual variety of that, but I haven't developed it for the last 15 years that I've been delving into these things very, very, very intensively. But I will. And that is part of ponerology, or the study of evil, and that is really the emphasis that I've undertaken, ritually and symbolically, as a curse to the world, because it has mocked the truth, it has mocked beauty, it has mocked what is right. So I spend my efforts demonstrating the deformities and chimerical beasts that have evolved out of this sewage, and to just, if I'm going through a nightmare, I may as well be awake to that fact, even if I can't wake up out of it. So I'm going to do that because it's just that bad. We're not talking about a few bad apples and a huge bunch of good ones at all, not even in the slightest. And we're talking systematic corruption. And instead of being like those who just bemoan it, I'm doing something about it by exposing it, by analyzing it, by demonstrating it, so that it's not merely my opinion and it's not merely something I'm venting about. And by doing this publicly, I'm giving others an opportunity to examine it and evaluate it according to their own experience and abilities to judge. And hence, I'm actually giving good faith to the public, which it may or may not deserve. Some elements of it might, and I'm hoping it gets to them, but in all likelihood, we live in one of those worlds where the internet topologies are somehow intricately designed to obscure the flow of information enough that those who need it may not get it. It may be that bad, but if it's that bad, then we're that close to the end. The end is found to be directly in proportion, by the way, to the conditions of affairs in which a spirit either thrives, inverse in proportion to those where a spirit thrives. If it's thriving well, a true spirit, from the origin of all spirit, is thriving, and that world is in inverse proportion likely to end. There's more time in that world, for that world. It's worthy of time. It's worthy of being experienced. It's worthy of manifesting more. And if it turns out to be less and less, well, then it's less worthy. And then if it ever inverts past some certain demarcation so that it's actually destroying value, and if it's doing so particularly under guises of doing the opposite, so it's just utterly destroying people's incapacity to recognize that values are being destroyed, and it's just getting that bad, it's basically turning into hell right in front of you, and that needs to stop. Because that's only going one direction, to hell. And that to oblivion. Not everybody's on board for that. I'm not. I'm not joining these groups. I'm not doing these things. I've never been. They attempted to corrupt me in my youth. They abused me in various ways. They tried to program me. They tried to use all kinds of programming techniques. Didn't work in the end. There were some false starts in their direction, I'm sad to say, but that's what happens when you push somebody too far, and they're not even fully developed as a person yet. But none so heinous, really, as to really mark me on a characterological level. It's mostly just not having good people in my life, having just enough bad ones to turn that into a nightmare. You just need a few bad ones when there's no good ones at all. One good one can dispel 10 bad ones. They're of the same magnitude and intensity. A manifestation in the world. That's the difference between a spirited person and a damn robot. And they're 1/10 as corruptible. So that's just an estimation. But the world in which this took place, it totally went against the grain of who I truly am, and then when I discovered who I truly am against that grain, and committed to it throughout my life, I definitely distinguish myself from the unfortunate being who preceded me in youth, and who also was definitely never in any way fully given to those wrongnesses which were inculcated in him intentionally. In my current state, I'm moving forward and further forward into further along into the solidification and elaboration simultaneously of all that has come before that's been good, and likewise, inversely, the destruction of and elimination of all that bad I've been doing. No one's pushed me to do that. No one of us are. And that's where in the praxeology I will end up going when I discuss authority figures. Some who have misrepresented themselves in the world and misrepresented the essence of Gnosticism as something to be, in the end, the equivalent of their own little personal MK Ultra project, would be cult project. And people that do that kind of stuff, they can often be quite thorny, hairy people. I mean, metaphorically and sometimes literally. And in the case of the person not thinking, definitely both. But if studied long enough and if examined carefully enough, just like any other complicated tangle, they can be undone from their appearances and then seen directly in their substance, and then one can find out just what's really going on with this creature. And there are some that I will focus on in that regard, but the point is just to say that when it comes to the expression of authority in the world, it's done by recapitulation of virtue in action, demonstrated independently within the self, not projected at one from another dimension. That happens to demons. Demons can't wake up without being woken up, even if they actually have a negative form of this, which tends to always convert this into this, which we might represent, say, a demonic form would be something more this. And I would, because duality has to be built into the logic used at any level of Gnostic philosophy. It just has to. There's no other way. And I can demonstrate that in every conceivable way, so that will be done. But until then, that's what I'm saying, and that's later what I'll be proving. And QED is going to be my middle name. If anyone says otherwise, they'll be surprised if they just stick around long enough. But I don't think the world's going to last long enough to see all this come to full fruition. But that just makes me happier, because that means all the hypocrisy and lies can end. That means all the abuse can end. That means all the murdering and fraudulent activity can end. That means all the covert actions can end. That means all the subtle cowardly aggressions against real people can end. And fake people going around with hats that say real on them can end. I've seen that. Basically, if you're real, you don't have to do that in public. You're not out in public to just, talk about how real you are as a megaphone. I'm specifically raising the issue of substance. What they're doing is the equivalent of just saying the Gnostic truth and never posting a single video. We get into the internet topologies and the praxeology, but I'm going to expose that full on as I can. But it wouldn't surprise me that there's a way to counteract those types of control or expose them. That's just not inside my area of specialty, so I have to talk to an IT person, computer scientist, and figure out what's going on there. And as we get to those matters, we'll return again and again to some features of expression which were originated in the logic and which have an underpinning that can be metaphysically specified, and with a logic suited to that. That is far too abstruse to go into in this series at this stage of the videos I'm presenting. So we're just going to start with the epistemology and come down to the everyday. And it's going to get from the most general to the most particular. There's going to be examples that look so petty, so tiny, so inane, so picayune, so you would almost think that someone were just imagining things and throwing them together, but actually no. When you get to the hexity of things, the hexity, when you get to the hexity of things, which is the essential property that this symbol represents in any of its different contexts, you're getting to the substance of something as an individual and as one type. Not as one type of kind of thing or entity, but as entity as such. You're getting to entity as such, which should be distinguished from properties, to be distinguished from characteristics and all these. We have a direct intuition of that. This isn't something made up any more than properties and qualities are made up, any more than substances are made up. These things aren't made up. Logic's not made up. Algebra is not made up. Chemistry is not made up. Hexity is not made up. Essence is not made up. Consciousness is not made up. None of this is made up. But the relations can't be borne out in their fullness without a longer process of extrapolating on them, expositing them. So that will be done further and further, to the point, though, that we will get to a point where there will be very specific examples, so tediously unique and specific that your heart couldn't want for more of that, and to the most abstract and general as well, going the other direction toward the metaphysics or toward the metaphysical reaches of any exposition in the form of symbolic logic here, or any logic, including intuitive logic, intuitionist and otherwise. But that's the direction it's going, and this is where it's gotten so far in terms of actual presented forms of content. So this is just part one of a series that's going to continue now, perhaps on a daily basis. Until next time.